Welcome everyone to an hour with Christopher Ruocchio. Christopher is a relatively new writer who has published three novels so far uh, of a series, the Sun Eater, that has got five books total, two more coming. I read the first one because my agent is the same as his agent. She asked me to give him a blurb, and which I did, and it's really very good. And so we are going to spend this hour with Christopher. We're going to talk about a series first, and then toward the end, he'll start doing readings from. Is it your next book, Christopher?
I was going to read from the first one. I
From the
figured
first one. Okay,
most
fine.
folks might not know it anyway. So
Yeah. All right, that's fine. So, Christopher, could you just sketch for people what the series is? Just give people a.
yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me, and thanks for watching, everybody. The Sun Eater is sort of a science fantasy space opera series set about 20,000 years in the future. Mankind has conquered a huge swath of the galaxy, by no means the whole thing, because galaxies are always a little bit bigger than a lot of space opera series tend to depict them as. And my main character is a guy called Hadrian, who's a nobleman in this big sort of Romanesque galactic empire. And he runs away from home pretty early in book one. He wants to be a scholar. Things do not go his way, and he ends up stuck in the middle of a war between said empire and an alien species called the Cielson, who are the first technologically advanced enough species to stand up to said empire in all of that time. It's written kind of like a memoir, sort of reminiscent of Book of the New Sun, which is a big influence on me. And Hadrian tells us on page one that he's the man who ended that war and who defeated all of the aliens, and this is why and how and about all the things no one knows. So it sort of plays too with the official version of the story versus his own and some stuff like that. So yeah, that's sort of the general overview of what the Sun Eater is. Like Eric said, I got two books still in production. The first is Empire of Silence. Whoops, wrong hand. It's always hard to do backwards. Second's Howling Dark, and the third, Demon in White, just came out 2 months ago now. And I've done a couple spin-off things. This is one of them. It's an indie title. But the three main ones are all through DAW Books.
Okay, what should the reader know going in, if anything?
Well, more or less what I've said, but I also like to mention too that I obviously I've been a science fiction fan my whole life, all 4 years of it, and and this is a series that's hugely influenced by the sorts of books that I grew up reading. Not just science fiction books. There's a lot of fantasy influence as well. As I said, I'm a huge Tolkien fan, but I'm a huge Dune fan. And for those of you who haven't read Dune, all like two of you, it's about the danger that charismatic leaders sort of pose to society. And Frank Herbert was very negative about heroes in general, and I wanted to try and flip his flipping of the script back onto its head and figure out if there was a way in which charismatic leaders could still be worth having despite the dangers they pose. And so I like to start with, yes, there are a lot of similarities to Dune. Those are on purpose. I'm trying to go back on Frank Herbert's sort of thesis, if you will, with Dune, and come at it from a different angle. And I just sort of like to throw that in at the beginning.
I noticed when I read it, it struck me very much. There was, I don't know how to describe it. It's not like Dune, the plot's, everything different, but it had a kind of resonance to me with the same, sort of spirit that Dune had. That kind of scope of space opera, that was the sense I got in it. It was quite striking.
Yeah, and I borrowed a couple like technologies as well too, because I wanted people to be thinking about Dune, but to also get a sense that this is going in a pretty different direction. There's actually a point pretty early on where he thinks he's going to school on this pretty arid planet, and it's kind of a nod to Arrakis, right? But he ends up on a completely different world that's covered in ocean, and it's sort of a symbolic joke about how this is actually not Dune, guys. It just looks like it.
Well, it's definitely not a clone of Dune.
No.
I mean, it's not the same story at all, but it just has a resonance to it that, let me put it this way, I think people who enjoy Dune are likely to enjoy your series.
That's my hope.
And let me ask you, Could you tell us more about the universe of the Sun Eater? I mean, who are the I don't know, the major players, so to speak, in the on the stage?
Yeah, so like I said, humanity has been expanding into the galaxy for several thousand years now. The big player is a multi-planetary feudal empire called the Solon Empire, after our star rather than after the planet. Everyone else goes Terran, so I figured I'd change it up. And the Solon Empire has existed for about 15, 16,000 years at this point. And it's got a pretty strong central imperial presence, with administrative, districts and stuff, much the way that the Romans did. But it also has independent systems that are ruled by feudal lords who are allied with the imperial house, who will, send levies to the empire and things like that. Far and away are they the largest player on the stage. Hadrian's father is a very obscure lord from a very ancient house. So he's sort of in this weird place where he is from this very exalted, very ancient family, but they're kind of down on their power and influence. So he's got the pedigree, which in this universe comes with a lot of genetic enhancements. He's expecting to live for several centuries. He's faster, stronger, all the $6 million man tropes than a normal person. But there are other groups as well, because empires being empires, there are people who don't want to be in them, and they've spread out and colonized further and further, sort of in a wedge towards the center of the galaxy, where star systems are more numerous and denser. And these are what the Empire calls freehold nations. Sort of towards where the galaxy's got an arm called the Norma arm. So in they're the Norman freeholds, which is sort of a riff on the Normans from the Middle Ages. And they tend to have all sorts of smaller nations, maybe just the one planet or even part of a planet or a few systems at a time. And they've run out beyond the ambit of imperial influence. And eventually the empire catches up with them a few centuries later and annexes these territories that all these smaller nations have built up quite conveniently. There are some people who think this is actually an imperial expansion strategy in the first place, is driving all the undesirables ahead of them and then taking their stuff in a few centuries. There are a couple other nations as well. There's a group called the Commonwealth, the Lothrian Commonwealth. They are a bit more totalitarian. They're off in another corner. They've got almost as many worlds as the Empire has at this point. They ran away from imperial influence very early on in human expansion and started to build up their own thing. They don't get on with the Empire so much. They've got kind of a Cold War detente situation going on there. They're trying to stay out of this war with the aliens, which is on the other side of the Empire. And there's some smaller nations as well. Thing I should mention about the Empire is they're pretty technophobic. They've got a pretty strong, this is one of the things I borrowed from Dune, because I wanted to tell a story ultimately that was about human beings. And to do that in the distant future, you have to find a way to get rid of transhumanism, because that raises a lot of questions about where we're going to be even in 100 years, much less another 20,000. And so the Empire has a sort of judicial bureaucratic church that whose primary function is to go around making sure nobody's flirting with artificial intelligence or other technologies that might pose a threat to the Empire's political hegemony by letting populations become too developed. And so your average imperial peasant lives, if not a medieval existence, certainly a maybe early industrial one. So that just should give you a little bit of an overview of the sort of human players that we're looking at here.
Okay, why is the one of the things that struck me is how do I put this? Why is the Sun Eater universe the way it is? I mean, it's got this very kind of medieval feel to it, and so why is it why is it feudal, and or roughly feudal, and why do so many people live medieval lives? And one of the things I can say this as a science fiction writer myself, there's always this temptation when you write stories set in the future to fall back on old social tropes. So there are many space operas out there that have set in the future where the societies are medieval, imperial. You've got a ruling monarch, and then I'm sitting there oftentimes reading it saying, let me see if I got this straight. We got rid of all this stuff already by the 20th century. So why the hell is this medieval nonsense coming back, 1,000 years from now? I know the reason is because it's easy to write a story when you've got a prince.
Right.
Because you can start right off with not having to explain how come your young protagonist has a lot of influence, because, well, naturally he does as a prince. I mean, look, it's not like I haven't done this plenty of times in the 1632 series.
Sure.
I don't have a problem with it as long as the author understands that it's got to be sort of explained. Otherwise, I mean, to give an example, David Drake's Hammer Slammer series, you got mercenary armies in the future. Well, in our world, mercenary armies don't amount to a hill of beans, to be honest with you. So why in the future would they come back? Well, David actually has an explanation in the series that explains why that has happened. And anyway, so I said enough myself, but if you could sort of
yeah. Well, I think first, in like a literary sense, like you said, it is convenient, but I also think there's a certain romance and a drama to telling stories with a smaller cast of characters, and a monarchical government has a smaller cast of characters than the sort of bureaucratic republics that we've got going on these days. And a whole book of board meetings is not going to be as much fun. And I also, I am a classic student. I most of my education is in, Macedonian, Greek, Roman, Persian history, that sort of stuff. And that's all, these are the political mainstays of that period. And so I'm writing what I know to an extent too. But as far as like a diegetic in-universe explanation goes, we also tried in the Sun Eater universe all of this, bureaucratic republics, and we've experimented with totalitarian states and fascism and communism, and all of that didn't work out so well in what is now ancient history in Hadrian's time. Especially once we started getting the artificial intelligences involved to manage totalitarian states more effectively. Because one of the problems with really centralized big government states like ours or like the Soviets is that there's just too many variables to control, right? If you're centrally planning an economy, you might forget to produce, a hygiene product because it just didn't occur to you or something like that. But if you've got computers to sort of carry all those numbers for you, it becomes more feasible to manage totalitarian states. But the AI in Hadrian's universe tried to fix all problems, right? And in doing so, they caused a whole bunch of new ones, and were trying to manage humanity so much they put everyone basically in a box and plugged them into systems to take care of them so they would never die, never get hurt. And so they kind of waged war on humanity in the name of trying to keep them safe. And some people didn't like that because that's not really a life. And there was a big war that ended up with Earth being destroyed in ancient history. This is antiquity to Hadrian. It's maybe only a couple thousand years out from us. And what reemerged in this period was a human culture that wanted to be fully human again. And so they tried to, they decided to reinvest power in individual rulers, the very few survivors who got out of this whole war with the machines intact. And they started, there's someone wrote an article about the book about how the empire looks Roman because they're basically playing dress up. They have no cultural connection to the Roman Empire or to the Byzantines or the other antecedents they're pulling from, but they are putting on the costumes of history in a way sort of celebrating the fact that they are still human and have survived the machine attempt to change what humanity was and meant. And so this has continued now for thousands of years and has gone on for so long because due to genetic modification being the real way that progress has been done now that technological solutions are kind of verboten. The ruling class lives for centuries, and that's slowed down the rate of progress, which is also throttled tremendously because they don't want to risk another AI apocalyptic scenario. Again, they had a singularity and they didn't like it, and they put it back in the bottle as best they could. And so there is a sort of romanticism about the past that they sort of fell into deliberately. And now they don't even remember by Hadrian's Day. That's why they're doing it, which I hope was a satisfying explanation for you.
No, look, I have written several novels with David Weber in his Honor Harrington universe, and because I enjoy it thoroughly, he's got elaborate setting. I don't necessarily agree with everything he comes out. I mean, I argued with him off and on for years that his Havenite Republic, which is this kind of very aggressive militaristic welfare state, and I point out to David, there is no historical example of a military aggressive welfare state. The two don't really go together. The Roman Empire actually didn't do very much conquest. It was the Republic that did the conquest. And David's response was, well, you're right that there's no historical model, but I've created a logic and show me what's wrong with the logic. And I can't because, okay, it makes sense. The point is not, I don't know how to put this. As a reader, as long as the author makes clear to me that, yes, I understand that there are complexities involved with this, and I don't know how to put this. As long as the author doesn't assume I'm a dummy, I'm okay with it, because there's an explanation. I can probably have fun arguing about whether I think it would work or not. Doesn't matter. There's an explanation, and if I'm enjoying the story, let's keep going. And that's the reaction I had to your series was I remember when I was reading the book thinking, yeah, Christopher and I can undoubtedly spend many pleasant hours arguing over that or the other thing, but it doesn't really matter. It's coherent and it's I don't know how to put it. It's not dumb stuff. It's not, you just plant a king on top of an advanced industrial society and that king has complete powers. It's like, how did Louis the 14th,
right
on top of a spaceship, you know what I mean? Anyway, no, I thought the explanation you just gave, plus it was the same sense I had reading the book. I mean, it's coherent. There is a logic to it, and that pulls you in through the story. It's a very engrossing story.
Well, I'm glad I made the cut. So.
Well, no, look, I'll be honest. I get asked, as do lots of popular authors, I get asked to blurb for people often, and I usually politely sort of duck it because I'm not going to lie. And on the other hand, I do believe in most instances, at any rate, in my grandmother's old wisdom, if you haven't got anything nice to say, keep your mouth shut.
For sure.
And, I don't see any reason why I'm going to badmouth another author. So I won't blurb a book unless I like it. And I do read them. I don't, I may not always be able to finish it, but I can read far enough into it. I understand what the story is, what it's about, and I can say something coherent and intelligent about it. So, and I liked, and the thing was interesting, Christopher, it's not really my cup of tea in the sense, it's not the kind of story I normally get drawn to, which is striking to me how much I did get pulled into your story, because it's not like the kind of story that would naturally attract me. I did read Dune and I enjoyed it, but I haven't reread Dune in decades now. Because that kind of I don't know that kind of epic story. I don't particularly like epic fantasy, for instance. I like other kind of fantasy, but epic fantasy, I'm not a huge Tolkien fan.
Right.
I read them when I was a youngster, and I enjoyed it. But I think I reread it once, and it's just this is just a matter of taste.
Sure, it's not for everybody.
It's not a statement about quality. But I found your book really quite engrossing, and I found the whole background and the way it was done really quite good.
Well, thanks, Eric.
Yeah,
It does mean a lot.
I'd like to move on to another question. You
Yeah.
have these aliens in your series, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right. The Sealson or Chilson?
Yeah, Sealson, yeah.
Sealson. Okay. Could you tell us something about them?
Yeah, well, they're the big bad guys, right? They are sort of the Huns to the Empire's Rome, especially later in the series. So no one really understands where they came from or why they are the way they are, because they don't appear to justify their technological advancements. They are a extremely violent warrior caste species. They travel in these migratory clusters made out of like hollowed out asteroids and things. They don't have any planets, so no one knows exactly, as I say, where it is they've come from. And they will just fall out of the sky and light cities on fire, carry off people by the millions, mostly to eat them, because they are exclusively carnivorous, and happen to be protein compatible with human beings, which is a nice coincidence, because I know that doesn't always work. And so they have been now for about 500 years, I think, by the time Hadrian's story starts, preying on imperial colonies sort of near the center of the galaxy. Like I said, we finally expanded into their territory, and they've been lighting us up ever since. And it's very hard to fight an enemy like that because you can't go and raise their cities. And it's very hard to pinpoint something as small as a moon. The biggest ship's probably about moon size, in huge interstellar volumes. So the Empire has been kind of clueless on how to deal with them for a while. This is sort of problem you see historically with like the Sakai, right? The tribes that would menace the Persians, like the Masagitai and things like that. They didn't really know how to pin them down, where to find them. They wouldn't sit still and fight a proper battle like a Babylonian army would do. They would just keep running out. And the Sealson have been doing that. They've been picking small colonies off for centuries, and no one's been able really to deal with them. They aren't the only alien species in the galaxy, but they are the only one that's been able to travel interstellar distances and put up a fight with the Empire. The other ones tend to be behind us in terms of technological development, just as a way of dealing with the whole Fermi's paradox thing. Most aliens are just not advanced enough to have sent radio waves in our direction just yet. And so the Empire mostly has been pulling what empires usually do and has been colonizing their planets and improving, depending on whether or not you want the scare quotes, the lives of these other aliens. Hadrian encounters one of them, the Umand, in book 1. The Umand don't really speak in any way that we can understand. So they're just sort of there, and the humans are trying to figure out what to do with them. There's another species that comes in later, I think in book 3. Yeah, book 3, I think. There are only 3 books. Like, how could I lose track? Called the Urktani. And the Urktani are, they're sort of bird-like. They don't look like human beings at all, but we can really communicate with them, kind of think the same way. The Sealson are kind of rubber forehead aliens. They're about 8 feet tall, very skinny, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, and all that. Horns instead of your Klingon forehead ridges or your pointy Vulcan ears or whatever. But they don't think like us at all. They can't negotiate. They don't know how to trade. It just doesn't compute for them. So there's a bit where Hadrian's in a Mexican standoff with one of them in I won't say when or the context, but they're trying to, they've got guns to, the heads of members of the opposite species, right? And the Sealson, instead of trying to negotiate some sort of ceasefire, will just start killing prisoners as dominance display because they don't know how to negotiate reciprocity, which begs the question, how the hell do they build spaceships? Which is something that we need to figure out as the series goes on, because as I say, how they got where they are without a lot of the things that kind of undergird cooperation and civilization is one of the questions, one of the mysteries of the series.
And you don't. I only read the first book. I didn't get,
Mhm.
you know. The reason, by the way, is because I don't have much time to. It's every author I know complains about the same thing.
Yeah, man, my wife hasn't read any of them yet, so everyone is off the hook.
Yeah, no, I used to do more just, hey, this is fun reading, than I do now. But so my question is, you don't actually explain, at least so far, why the SEAL Center are the way they are, right?
I'm working on it right now, actually. In book 4, we're finally getting into the answers to those questions.
I faced a similar quandary in the Zhao Empire series that I started with Kathy Wentworth, and the dodge we used was that the Zhao had been uplifted by another species and had sort of been created to be that way, warriors. Now, what is starting to happen as time unfolds, because the Zhao rebel, is that they're starting actually to develop a culture. But that explains why they are so narrow when you first encounter them. Because
Yeah,
it is hard to explain. I know. It's like, how do these people build spaceships in the first place if they can't get along with each other? It's working with alien species is very tricky because you've got to make them work right. You really got to make them alien, or else they just seem like
people with weird hats. Yeah,
human beings with weird heads. But on the other hand, if you make them too alien, it just becomes impossible for readers to even understand what they're doing. It's a fine line to walk, and but it's a real fun challenge if you're a writer. It really
yeah. I've had a lot of fun trying to figure that stuff out and to contrast them too, because I've got, like I said, I got a few. And so I kind of wanted ones that looked human but didn't act that way, and then ones that didn't look human but acted human, and then ones that were neither, right? Sort of complete the triangle, as it were.
yeah.
Um,
How many? What's the distribution of intelligent alien species in your universe? I mean, how common?
uh, the like less advanced ones, we've covered about maybe a quarter of the galactic volume, and we found about 70. Um,
Right.
and some of those are already extinct. So not that many, and there's a reason for that too, that I also will be getting into as the series goes on. Um, but it's not by any means a completely empty universe. This is one of the things I wanted to do differently than Dune, right? Dune has no aliens to speak of. It has some exofauna, right, the sandworms and stuff. Although, depending on which school of Dune fandom you are, there's a chance those sandworms might have been engineered by human beings a long time ago. But I really wanted to get into the alien thing just to make sure that people knew that this was its own, this is a different thing. And because aliens are cool. So.
Well, yeah, it's always a. Um, I have often felt as an author that I'm sort of betraying my own beliefs because I think the reason that the Fermi paradox exists is the way it is. My own belief is that I think life emerges easily everywhere, but that's not true of complex life. I mean, I think there are a jillion places where we're going to find bacteria and single cell critters, but it took a long time. It took billions of years on Earth before complex life emerged. And complex life is a lot trickier. And then there really is no evolutionary drive toward intelligence. Intelligence, things like the ability to fly, the ability to see, torpedo shape in water, those things re-evolve over and over and over again because they have obvious adaptive advantages. But intelligence evolved once and quite late in the history of the world. I mean, this planet's going to become basically uninhabitable in about 1 billion years. So, I mean, we're late middle age before we even showed up. So I think the real answer to why there aren't very many intelligent species out there, at least that we can tell, is because there really aren't all that many, and it's a huge galaxy, and everybody's scattered all over the place. And the only final cherry on the cake, which I think you have to assume, is that we were just one of the very, very first. So there are not any really advanced intelligent species out there, because if there were, we would probably know about it by now.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's probably the real answer too. But I'll you got to
That's
throw
my
a couple
theory,
things
but then
in.
I sit down to write a novel. I also think faster than light travel is probably pure fantasy. But when I sit down as a writer to write a novel, there's so many convenient things about having faster than light travel and nifty aliens. And so I really feel like I'm kind of a rat. But
I know what you mean.
push comes to shove, I'm a storyteller. Anyway.
Yeah, it's supposed to be fun, right? If it's not
I
fun
know,
and it's
yeah.
not interesting,
Let me ask
sometimes,
you,
yeah.
how does interstellar travel work in your universe?
Yeah. So, like you said, things being nifty and convenient. I do have interstellar travel. Basically, I use a Star Trek style warp drive, right? But Star Trek and Star Wars alike frustrate me in how fast it takes to get places. Luke and Han get to Alderaan in, as far as I can tell, about 10 minutes, which means there's no seafaring culture, so to speak, right? There's no.
The thing I remember from the second movie was when Luke flies to Dagobah. He goes to find Yoda, and he flies there in what is basically a fighter plane. And I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute, let me see if I got this straight. He crosses interstellar distances in a single-seater fighter plane. I don't want to be crude about this or anything, but how does he eat? How does he,
Yeah.
evacuate? And how does he not get leg cramps? I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's like, oh, come on.
Yeah, it's 20 seconds.
Anyway,
And
go ahead.
you lose out too on your like the Odyssey style weird adventures and people losing their minds, stuck on a boat, and all those are interesting storytelling bits of storytelling drama, right? So it still takes years and sometimes decades to get from one planet to another, even moving several hundred times in some cases, the speed of light, because the Empire does take up about a quarter of the galaxy. I didn't want to be Star Wars with a literal entire galaxy mapped out and civilized, practically speaking. I mean, I know that like Tatooine and the Outer Rim is kind of the Wild West, but everyone knows where everything is. There's no mystery left, and that makes me sad from a storytelling perspective. So it still takes people ages to get places, and I'm not trying to work out the Einstein math either, because I'm not clever enough to do the general relativity equations and figure out, oh, it's been 5 years for our heroes, but 200 years at home. I don't want to figure any of that out. And so warp drive lets me sidestep the time dilation problems, but still have these hugely protracted voyages. And so most of the characters will freeze themselves for these long journeys in cryonic stasis, and they'll lose years and decades relative to the people who are still awake. Actually, a huge subset of the Imperial Legion's naval officers only job is to be ferrymen, basically. And they'll retire pretty quickly because they're taking a 20-year cruise with a 200 person complement when they get off. Like, yeah, that's not a fun job. But they're done. They retire, because that's a full career for someone whose life hasn't been artificially extended, certainly. In Hadrian's case, like he'll usually spend a few months in transit before he frees himself, just to get some peace in. But yeah, the whole empire is stitched together by this sort of weird extra class of people who will stay awake for huge amounts of time, and everyone they know and care about back at port is getting decades and even centuries older or dying while they're in transit. So I'll have members of the cast age dramatically between books relative to others, because they'll be differentially frozen relative to one another, which has been kind of a fun thing, because it kind of gives me a new cast of characters each time I open the book, even though it's the same people, which has been fun.
Yeah, no, I don't think I'll probably get around to writing it, because I've got enough on my plate as it is. But I've thought about a a setting where you do have interstellar travel, but as you say, it takes a long, long time. It takes even longer than sailing voyages did in the age of sail, when it would take 6 months to a year to go around to the other side of the world. And what happens is a cast of people emerges that has their own, because they do have the time dilation effect, but they really become a complete society of their own, and they live on these ships. It's a little bit close to what Heinlein did in Citizen of the Galaxy with that cast of traders he developed. And it would be a fascinating story to work on, but I'm probably never going to be able to get around to it. Let me ask you then, just to, because we want to give you time to do readings from your books, but one last question. So how would you characterize your series? I mean, you use the term space science fantasy, but that doesn't quite seem right to me, but I can explain why. But to me, science fantasy is something like what James Schmidt did with The Witches of Caries, where technically it's science fiction, but basically the Clotha powers they amount to magic. I mean, officially they have some scientific basis, but it's never explained. I know what you mean, that there's a sense of that in your books, but I don't know how to put it. It's got the sort of scope of epic fantasy, but I wouldn't actually call it a type of fantasy. But that's just me. What would you say?
Well, I will say that does change as the series progresses, because there is another alien species that we didn't really get to, called the Quiet, that Hadrian falls in with sort of late into book 1, and they become more and more important as the series progresses, and they can do things that might be magic. And so as the series goes on, I think it does get a little bit more of a straight up science fantasy feel to it. But I think the general characterization, especially book 1, that this is a science fiction universe that's written in the style of an epic fantasy, is something that's consistent throughout the whole thing. I wanted it to have that sort of Dune, Game of Thrones, Baroque cast of thousands feel to it, and to be, centered on character and setting more than the technology. Although I try really hard not to break too many laws of physics, right? There's no explosions in space, to pick on Star Wars again, things like that. But I did want it to feel more fantasy than science fiction in terms of the literary style. As the series goes on too, I think that in terms of like these sort of subgenre flavors of each volume are different. Book 2 goes beyond the imperial borders to where technology is not as well policed, and it in places feels very cyberpunk. It also feels like a gothic novel at one point, because Hadrian gets trapped on this very strange planet with some weird post-humans and things like that. And it's got kind of a Gormenghast vibe to it. I'm a big Mervyn Peake fan. And book 3 has got more of like a Sinbad, like high adventure vibe to it, but also some political thriller elements. And book 4 has got some dystopian stuff, and a little bit more Lovecraft. And so like I've been trying to change not the kind of food it is. They're all still pizzas, but the topping volume to volume has been changing, which has been another fun thing to do.
All right. I'm going to back off now and let Christopher read from it for the rest of his hour. But I will. I urge people to look into these books, investigate them, because they really are good, and they're quite distinctive. So anyway, with that, Christopher, why don't you go ahead and start reading?
Will do. All right. And yeah, so I'm going to read from Empire of Silence, which I'm going to hold up instead of try to point to. Again, well, I'll do both, which is up there on the wall. This is book 1. A figure, like I said, odds are most folks tuning in haven't read any of my work yet, so I'll start at the beginning. I'm going to do 2 shorter readings. I don't think we're going to go the rest of the hour, but we might get a little close. I'm going to read literally from page 1, because that seems like the best thing to do. And then I'm going to actually read a snippet from quite late in the book, because I wanted you guys to see some of the aliens as well. So as I say, this is written in sort of a memoir style, in much the same way that Book of the New Sun is Severian's account of how he came to the throne. This series is Hadrian's account of how he got embroiled in this terrible conflict and why he did the things he did. And so here we go, right from page 1. Light. The light of that murdered sun still burns me. I can see it through my eyelids, blazing out of history from that bloody day, hinting at fires indescribable. It was like something holy, as if it were the light of God's own heaven that burned the world and billions of lives with it. I carry that light always, seared into the back of my mind. I make no excuses, no apologies, no denials for what I have done. I know what I am. The scholiasts would start at the beginning with our remote ancestors clawing their way from old Earth's system in their leaking vessels, those peregrines making their voyages to find new and living worlds. But no, to do so would take more volumes and ink than my hosts have left at my disposal, and even I, who have had more time than any other, have not the time for that. Should I chronicle the war, then? Start with the alien Cielson howling out of space, their ships like castles of ice. You can find the war stories, read the death counts, the statistics. No context can make you understand the cost. Cities razed, planets burned, the countless billions of our people ripped from their worlds to serve as meat and slaves for those pale monsters. Families old as empires ended in light and fire. The tales are numberless, and none of them is enough. The empire has its official version, of course, one which ends in my execution, with Hadrian Marlowe hanged for all the worlds to see. I do not doubt that this tome will do aught but collect dust in the archive where I have left it, one manuscript amongst billions at Culchus. Forgotten. Perhaps that is best. The worlds have had enough of tyrants, enough of murderers and genocides. But you will read on, perhaps, tempted by the thought of reading the work of so great a monster as the one made in my image. You will not let me be forgotten because you know, you want to know what it was like to stand aboard that impossible ship and rip the heart out of a star. You want to feel the heat of two civilizations burning and to meet the dragon, the devil that wears the name my father gave me. So let us bypass history, sidestep the politics, the marching tramp of empires, forget the beginnings of mankind in fire and in the ash of old earth, and so too ignore the Cielson rising in air and from darkness. Those tales are elsewhere recorded in all the tongues of mankind and her subjects. Let us move to the only beginning I have any right to, my own. Born the eldest son and heir to Alistair Marlowe, Archon of Maidwa Prefecture, Butcher of Linan, and Lord of Devil's Rest. No place for a child, that palace of dark stone. But it was my home all the same, amid the Logothete ministers and the armored peltasts of father's service. But father never wanted a child. He wanted an heir, someone to inherit his slice of empire and to carry on not as a man in himself, but as an extension of our family. He named me Hadrian, an ancient name meaningless save for the memory of those men who carried it before me, an emperor's name fit to rule and to be followed. Dangerous things, names. Perilous, they begin our shaping for better or ill, guiding us by the hand or by opposition. I have lived a long life, longer than the genetic therapies, the great houses, the peerage can contrive, and I have had many names. During the war, I was Hadrian the half-mortal and Hadrian the deathless. After it, I was the sun-eater. To the poor people of Borisivo, I was only a myrmidon named Had. To the Jadians, I was Al Nerobles. To the Cielson, Oim Belu, and worse things besides. I have been many things. Soldier and servant, captain and captive, sorcerer and scholar, and little more than a slave. But before I was any of these things, I was only a son. And that's the opening. So I'm going to skip ahead, like I said, quite late in the book. Just wanted to give you guys a sense of Hadrian's second meeting, actually. Some would say his first, with the aliens, the Cielson. Some slight spoilers, so if that's not your thing, we're near the end of the stream, and if you want to duck out, I totally understand. But I don't think this really gives away any more than answering the questions already has in terms of the general shape of the conflict. So, without further ado, let's jump on in. If the Cielson objected to the lieutenant's presence, they gave no sign. They held their silence close, watchful as the ever-present stars which lurked somewhere beyond the stone that formed the roof of our world. Basander and I stopped, alone in that empire of silence. Ha, I said it. Then a heavy foot fell. Another. A third. The Cielson captain lumbered from the dark, leaning hard against one of the slanting pillars about the altar, one leg weak beneath it. The alien carried its helmet in the crook of its man-long arm, and it pulled lips back from sharp teeth as it appeared. No words of Scholiast's wisdom came to mind, nothing to stem a tide of rage or fear. But I didn't need them, for there was no rage, no fear. I felt clean, unclouded, ready. Plunging into the dark, away from the light and order of the world in which I had toiled for so many years, the concerns of that ordered world dropped away. I forget, the Cielson sounded dry as straw, as bone, how small your people are. This one was shorter than the one I shot with the disruptor in the cavern above, but yet stood nearly 8 feet high. The features of its strange face were more pointed than those of that other, its eyes more slanted than round, its hair longer and braided at the left shoulder. I stopped before I spoke, noticing the hand the creature pressed to its side, just below where the kidney would be if it were a human being. Tuka okarin ikuchem, I said. You're injured. The alien did not argue. Eka, it agreed with a clockwise roll of its head. I am. Then it added, it is nothing serious. The suit took the worst of it. I can speak for my men. I believe you. I gestured to the lieutenant beside me. Cielson, this is Basander Lin, I cast about for a word that would encapsulate the meaning of lieutenant. He is a small captain, I said at last. When Lin noticed my use of his name, I repeated the words in standard for him and said, my name is Hadrian Marlowe. Hadrian. The alien attempted to wrap its toothy mouth around my name. Marlowe. It pulled back its lips again, and in the stark white light of Basander's suit, I saw its gums were black. I am Itana Uvanari Ayatom, once captain of the ship you shot down. It pointed one finger at the roof above our heads, groaned, hissed like a wounded cat, and slumped against the column it leaned against. Still, in the Cielson tongue, I replied, will you surrender? Can you ensure the safety of my men? It looked me up and down. I knew what it saw. A small man, not dressed for war, haggard, his hair tangled across his face. The details of my dress must have collapsed into some clear understanding, bridging the gulf between species. I was no soldier. I would never be. I can't, no. I knew I had said otherwise moments ago, and so curbed this revelation, saying, but I can try, will try. I glanced at Lieutenant Lin and relayed the Cielson's concerns. The lieutenant shook his helmeted head. I don't know what the Night Tribune will do with them, Marlowe. Shifting to standard in order to better reply to the man, I said, I can't tell it that. He only shrugged, face invisible through his helmet, hands ready on the stock of his plasma rifle. What choice does it have? I could almost hear the eyebrows rise behind Basander's helmet mask. When I repeated the question for the Cielson captain, who bared its glass splinter teeth again in a venomless snarl, rolled its head counterclockwise on its neck. There is always a choice. It tipped its face skywards towards the confusion of crooked pillars and black archways that supported the distant arc of the ceiling. The people never forget how to die, Yokaji. It was strange hearing the word people, Cielson, pronounced in context. You want to die? I asked. Uvenari looked down on me from its height, lips stretched only a little, like a dog on the edge of growling. Its slitted nostrils flared, and it looked away again. Uti wetidiu bawemurinu wemetoji. It sounded like poetry, like scripture. I was slow in translating it. In the time of dying, we will die, it said. I stifled a groan. If it wasn't poetry, it was certainly a quotation. Earth and Emperor, I was talking to an alien version of myself. I struggled to incorporate this newfound philology into my understanding of the alien captain, who seized my silence as an opportunity to add, there are worse places and ways to die. That was a mistake, giving me something I could more easily respond to. Aware of the other Cielson lurking in the dark behind, I said, that may be, but not today. None of you has to die today if you surrender. I injected as much urgency as I could into my tone, praying to I know not whom, that the emotion might cross the gap between our species. Let Plato be right. Surrender, throw down your arms, and we will not hurt you. You can walk out of this place. None of you has to die here. I wanted to explain that I was a lord, that I could offer my protection, such as it was. But if the Cielson had equivalent concepts in their culture, I did not know them, and so remained mute. I heard a stirring in the shadows, a congress of whispers. Uvenari glanced back over its shoulder, shouted something coarse and inchoate to silence them. The one with the deep voice answered back, too fast to catch. What is going on? Sir Olerin asked from the doorway, seizing his opportunity to mirror the actions of the Cielson across the way. Busander shouted back, I don't know. I waved them both to silence and took an involuntary step forwards. This is not our war, Captain. We inherited it, you and I, and all of us. It will go on only so long as your people and mine are willing to die for it. Not one of the people has surrendered to your kind, not in all our generations. Well, then it is time to start, I said. And I will cut off the reading there. Just a clip from the middle of a much larger chapter, obviously. I don't know if Eric is coming back or not, but thank you everyone for tuning in. I really hope you enjoyed our conversation, the readings, and thanks for taking the time to be here, today. And I hope that you'll check out the books. The first one, as I say again, is Empire of Silence. The rest of them you can see on the wall behind me. And if you want to check out more of my website, is Sollan Empire, SOLLAN Empire.com. Thanks everybody, and have a nice day.